This is the July 19th meeting of the East Norwalk Neighborhood Association. We do have a guest speaker and a presentation this evening. So after some announcements, we'll introduce Steve Kleppin, and then following his presentations, we will open up the room for some comments, suggestions, questions, etc. Apologies on the short notice here, but apparently there are 3 public hearings tomorrow night. You can get more information by going to the city website to review the documents. In the emails that I sent yesterday, you'll also see some links to the agendas for those public hearings. There is a public hearing through the Ordinance Committee that's dealing with polystyrene food service products to include them as an environmental hazard. And I believe that has to do with restrictions on the use of styrofoam for food preparation and takeout and delivery services. They also have a public hearing having to do with fireworks sales and exhibition of fireworks within the city. Unrelated, I think, to the complaints that we've had for the past 4 months in terms of illegal firework use within the city and the police enforcement. And then there's also a public hearing regarding the what's being proposed as the merger of the 2 land use commissions, planning and zoning. And there are some documents in there regarding that. What I didn't see regarding that was kind of like an executive level summary on the why this is being considered. And I hope that before they make any decisions on that one, that someone may be able to put together a sheet on the pros and cons of either keeping those 2 commissions separate or merging them. I don't believe that anything that's being proposed suggests that those positions are elected positions. As you know, many other communities or you may not know, many other communities in Connecticut, zoning and planning commissioners are actually elected officials. In Norwalk, they're appointed by the mayor and approved by the Common Council. The Zoning Commission has a meeting this coming Wednesday at 6 o'clock via Zoom. I'll ask Steve Kleppin when we bring him on just to confirm that these items are on the agenda, because some of them look like they may have been copied over from the prior one. But it looks like a continued review of the East Norwalk Village TOD zone, which Steve will be presenting tonight for the text amendment change that would allow the creation of the zone. It did indicate a continued review of the 25 Van Zandt Street application, which would move to allow trade and vocational schools in the city's Industrial 1 zones. And that also includes an application to actually implement a vocational and trade school at that property at 25 Van Zandt. Just for the record, ENNA largely supports that use within the industrial zones and within East Norwalk. We do have some concerns about it, and we recently invited the applicants to come to our August meeting and present their plans as they continue through the zoning approval process. The status on the industrial zones is an update that Steve Kleppin is expected to give to the commissioners. He pretty much does that every month just to keep them in the loop. And I think there's a continued discussion on the self-storage and warehouse distribution moratorium, but that may also be a duplicate on that agenda. It may have already been approved by them. And then on the 29th, you'll see from our emails that there's a major kickoff event in the city related to the zoning regulations update, which is a thorough review of all the regulations and all the zones within the city. Some of you may recall that ENNA formed a subcommittee to look at zoning regulations within just 06855. We'll be getting those over to Steve Kleppin and presenting those so that they can be considered as they start getting feedback from the community on this. It is on the 29th via Zoom at 6 p.m. And you do have to register to participate, to either observe or participate in it. And there's a supplemental website that they've set up to do that called zonenorwalk.com. And I'm told by Steve Kleppin that will also be merged in with the other website you're used to going through for planning, which is tomorrow.norwalkct.org. And then finally, we're trying to get information out on this, that the public sessions for the project called Norwalk Speaks is still ongoing. You can go to their website to see their upcoming events where they have public participation in person and via Zoom. And that's the initiative to ensure inclusivity and equity throughout all of the city, throughout the city, actually. Okay, again, the links to almost all of this is in the emails that you would have received on the weekend. And as that's coming up here, just for folks who don't already know Steve or have been at some of our meetings where Steve has been our guest, or at the public meetings that he holds and in his capacity as staff to the land use commissions. He is the director of planning and zoning for the city. So both of those functions and the commissions all fall under his purview. His staff also includes, I don't think this has changed, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but you also have conservation and inland wetlands under planning as well.
Correct.
So those three groups actually report into Steve, and Steve reports into the group that falls under economic development, transportation, mobility, and parking, and planning and zoning through Jessica Vanashek, who then reports up to the mayor as well. Is that correct, Steve? I get that right?
Yep.
Okay, so I think we allowed you to share your screen here, and what Steve is going to be doing is giving a presentation that I think is essentially the same as what he has presented to the zoning and planning commissions, so that they have an overview for their approval of the actually implementing the changes now that will create the East Avenue Village TOD zone, which is essentially I-95 down to Gregory Boulevard. And I think Steve will share the map on that. And he'll discuss the zoning regulations that would be involved with this, the major changes. I think you're going to talk about design guidelines if we have time. And then the logic behind where we stand with bonus amenities that get awarded for density and height. And Steve, just before you start, I wanted to say that we've published out the links to the ENNA community so that they can read the documents firsthand rather than us trying to give them the Reader's Digest version there. But I did notice that if someone wanted to review everything and be able to provide comments and suggestions and any questions, it's about 45 or 50 pages in total. And I'm not quite sure. I do think some people are probably going to go line by line so they really understand what's being proposed. And I just don't I wanted to hear from you what you think the best way is for people to communicate some very specific questions as they're going through the documents, or comments or suggestions. Do you want them to go directly to you? Would you feel that it's more efficient if it comes through ENNA and we compile it and then meet with you?
It's either way. It doesn't make a difference to me. However you want to do it, it's fine.
Okay, I mean, certainly we're not going to tell people not to write directly because we know that we do like to hear from people. But we may make an effort in our own analysis of this then to see if we can compile as much feedback as we can. I think right now we probably have about, we parse line by line. So I think right now between the consultant's review and your documents, we probably have like 6 pages of some feedback and questions.
And before I go into the, sure. And before I get into the reason we're here tonight, just a couple of the items you touched on earlier. I didn't go on the ordinance committee's webpage, but there is a memo put together that outlines the rationale for merging the two commissions. If you can't find that, just email me and I can send it out to you. The moratorium discussion is not on the zoning commission agenda. The public hearing is set for, I think it's the second August meeting, but I have to confirm that. So, but it's not going to be on is the zoning agenda for discussion.
Okay, it was actually on the agenda as of yesterday. That's why I thought maybe that agenda had some typos in it as carryover. So you might want to just check it before Wednesday.
Yeah, Brian was out last week, so I'm sure
Okay.
it's a little updated, needs to get updated.
Okay.
And
But the public hearing will not be any sooner than the second zoning commission?
No, it's the planning commission. No, it may be the first August meeting, which I think is the 5th. So it's probably August 5th.
Okay, so we're talking about just a couple of weeks here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we do have the link to the zoning update page is on the P&Z page, and it should be on the Norwalk Tomorrow page shortly. We're just trying to find a good spot to make sure it's highlighted on there. All right, so thank you for letting me share a few minutes with you tonight to go over the regulation changes. As Diane mentioned, my name's Steve Kleppin. I'm the Planning Zoning Director for the city. I've been here going on 5 years now, which has really gone by in kind of a blink of an eye to me. I have about 30 slides. I tend to talk pretty quick, hopefully not too quick. So it shouldn't take, we won't be here for an hour listening to me talk about regulations for East Norwalk. Okay. So I kind of like to start out with this slide anytime I do any kind of discussions about anything like this, just because there's a lot of discussion about, development in Norwalk. So I wanted to share this slide. And it looks like my map moved a little bit, so my circles are off. But so the major areas of development in Norwalk that we focused on, this one, the circle should be over this way a little bit more, but this is the Merritt 7 area. This is kind of the Wall Street, West Ave, South Norwalk. And really this red circle, what this is kind of intended to show is that really the West Ave, Wall Street area going down into South Norwalk is really becoming what we call the urban core of Norwalk. So that's, as we go through the zoning rewrite, I'm imagining that a lot of these areas are going to be merged in terms of the conformity of what's allowed and what's allowed for the bulk and height. And then we'll carve out areas like Wall Street and Washington Street and North and South Main Street because of the historic significance of those two areas. And then there's some smaller scale areas like East Norwalk, which we're going to talk about tonight. And then like one of the larger planning efforts we're starting to talk about, and we'll go through over the next year or two, is the Route 1 corridor, because that's kind of what happens with retail in the future. Right now, I'm not thinking retail is ever going to go away completely. Who knows? I could be wrong, but I think there's always going to be a need for services and goods. But the way the Route 1 functions now is it really doesn't function at times. Aesthetically, it's not pleasing. From the landscaping to the building design to the signage. So there's a lot of things we can do to improve that. So that's something we'll focus on over the next couple of years. Okay, just a little bit of background, because I don't know if everybody that's on the call was familiar with the process and how we got to this point. But back in 2017, the city applied for a grant from the state of Connecticut to look at the East Norwalk station. So we received that grant. The state defines TOD as a half-mile radius from the transit station. So this yellow circle here on the map represents that area. A couple things to point out. In the middle, obviously, here's the two split branches of the station. We excluded the area north of 95 because we said, that kind of functions as its own animal. We left that alone. The total study area was just about 500 acres. And the plan and the amendment to the Plan of Conservation and Development was approved October of 2020. So from the plan, and I'm not going to read this for you, the plan, and I have links to some of the items later on, the plan, which is on the Norwalk Tomorrow site, has all the information there, including the appendices, but here's kind of some of the items that are in the vision and the goals, looking at enhancing quality of life. Walkability was a major, thing in that. We wanted to have areas where people could congregate, but congregate in a safe manner, not shaded areas, including green space and the ability to move around safely within the zone. And here, again, here's some more expanded themes that were talked about. One thing that came up was that East Norwalk identifies itself as kind of like a maritime theme. So that goes into some of the design elements and the architectural amenities and streetscape amenities that are called out later on in the plan. And another major component was trying to balance growth and also neighborhood character. So as you see, when we go forward, I'll kind of hopefully point out why we focus development in certain areas and why we left alone the vast majority of the overall study. Again, here's some key points, and I've kind of touched on a lot of these. One thing that came up a lot, which I'll touch on quickly, is parking. And I think parking is going to be a challenge for redevelopment going forward because of the, several things. Parking is always a major factor in any development because it's very expensive to build. Developers like to build buildings because they can get income from the construction portion of the buildings, but parking, whether it's surface or structured, it's not something they necessarily see an economic benefit to that. So parking is a challenge on that end. Given the small lot sizes for many of these parcels in there, getting enough land to have the required parking is also going to be a challenge. So that's something where the plan looked at ways to hopefully, look at shared parking, and hopefully people will realize that that's to their benefit as they look to redevelop these areas. We also looked at utilities, and we wanted to make sure there was enough in terms of water access, drinking water access, I should say. Also, make sure the city sewer system could handle additional development. And also the road network was a major concern. And I walked East Avenue down to the train station enough times at rush hour to know that, sometimes it just comes to a complete crawl. And there's a lot of things that are not within the city's control as it relates to 95 and then just like the push and pull of traffic at certain times of the day. But there are things hopefully that will get better once the East Avenue improvements come to life. So this is kind of the, and some of you may have seen this map before. This, and there's a next slide, kind of gives some text to what these numbers represent. So it comes down to really kind of 9 significant recommendations that came out of the plan. The one we're going to talk about tonight is number 1. That's kind of the biggest area, which is kind of the East Ave corridor with some, kind of offshoots along Van Zant and some other areas. This area is proposed, for the most part, this area is what we call neighborhood business. That's the zoning designation for those properties now. But we've proposed to rezone that to a new village district zone. And we're going to get into that in a lot of detail. The second recommendation was looking at this Osborne Avenue area here. So what happens over here is that, it's not like this is architecturally significant areas. They are a lot of areas of older homes, but they are more affordable than other parts of the city, especially other parts of East Norwalk. So the plan recommends looking at things like facade improvement programs, which are done in South Norwalk, which allows property owners to get basically a grant from the city through the redevelopment agency, where they can get some money to fix up the exterior of their house. That does come with some conditions that you obviously can't just demo the house or do those kind of things, or you have to pay that money back. But it's a way to help improve the properties where otherwise maybe they couldn't financially do that. Another recommendation of the plan, number 3, was to look at relocating the DPW garage. Obviously, the transfer station is down here, and that's obviously probably not going anywhere anytime soon. But do the trucks and other things have to be stored there? Can they be relocated to another part of the city? And can we repurpose this piece of property for something else? Now, what that something else is a completely separate planning exercise that we didn't get into, and will involve a lot of people and a lot of decisions down the road. Number 4 is looking at Liberty Square, and should this, it's kind of a cool little area. So we think maybe this might be a prime candidate for a historic district, and we'll have those conversations with the Historic District Commission going forward, and obviously involve the property owners because there are some items that come along with that. There are several areas labeled number 5. You can see through here, also down through here, and then way up on Winfield Street. And what number 5 is recommending is actually downzoning those. Those are right now zoned neighborhood business, and we're recommending downzoning those to C residential. And what happens there is we think that the commercial growth is already sometimes filling up some of those storefronts as a challenge on East Avenue as it is. So we think if in the future there's commercial growth, it should be in this corridor and not on the outskirts. And that hopefully will help alleviate traffic out in some of these areas. We understand that there are some businesses in these areas, and those become non-conforming. They can still continue to operate. It just may, in the future, if somebody has a bodega or something now, and they decide, what, I want to have turn it into townhouses or something, they can do that, but they wouldn't be able to go back to the bodegas down the road. They'd be kind of stuck in the residential at that juncture. Number 6 is, if I recall correctly, and I might have to defer to the next slide to get my answer. Number 6, it relates to, it might be a little hard to see on this screen, but this blue line, you can see that kind of runs along parallel to the railroad tracks. That land is all zoned industrial 1. So the plan recommends that that remains that way, and then that you look at some ways to help monetize commercial development in those areas by allowing maybe some very low density residential in those areas. We, as Diane had mentioned at the beginning, we are doing a study of the industrial zone. So that's looking at some similar recommendations. So we make dovetail those changes with the final recommendations of the industrial zone study. Number 7, which is kind of to the east of the cemetery here, just looks at rezoning a couple parcels into the new village district. Number 8 is what's a pedestrian promenade, which looks to connect the Cove Avenue area down towards Liberty Square. Oops, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. Cove Avenue area to Liberty Square. And it'd be basically, we're looking to capture a little of the property along Vets Park and turn that into an area where you can do different things. We have no specific programming for it, but it's obviously enhanced biking and walking. Maybe there's activities to do there. We saw some really cool examples of people had set up exercise stations along one of these, but it's an area that's just a much nicer, broader, safer area to walk. Lastly, number 9 is around Cove Ave, First Street, 2nd Street, in those areas. And this is kind of one of my favorite parts of Norwalk, and it's kind of a cool little area. And we think this might also be another good candidate for a historic district or some kind of village district designation. So that's something we'll look at, probably through an in-house planning exercise. I don't really have a date on that, maybe next year or the next 12 to 18 months, but that's just another one of the recommendations that comes out of the plan. And hopefully I got those correct, but it looks like I got most of those items correct. The plan does provide, it's a little easier to go back and forth, but it was hard to put all the text and everything onto the one slide. So again, just kind of a summary, this yellow kind of orange area, yellow outline with the orange dash through there is the proposed zone, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And again, the whole area, study area, was about 490 acres. The zone that's proposed is 35 acres around approximately, which represents about 7% of the whole study area. And we're actually down zoning those areas I mentioned that were neighborhood business about 13 acres, which is about 2.5% of the study area. So kind of the recommendations for the new zone and also the industrial 1 zone in summary are looking at the existing neighborhood business district. So that's basically this yellow outline with the orange slash. That's what the current zoning is. Rezoning that to a new village district. And what was kind of discussed very preliminarily at the beginning was where we proposed to allow 1 additional story of height and increasing the density, provided that they give back the community amenities. And I'm going to go into some detail on what those amenities are. We've come up with a point system and a formula for how those are applied. So the underlying zoning basically doesn't change. The neighborhood business-based zoning doesn't change. So if I own a property that's in this area now, and I wanted to come in and pull a permit to do a 2.5-story building, it wasn't too tall, I had all the parking requirements, and the uses were permitted in the zone, I could come in and develop that. They'll still be subject to the design guidelines, which I'll go into detail on, as well as, they have to provide wider sidewalks and those kind of things, but they don't get the extra bonus of extra density or height unless they provide the amenities that are outlined in that area. Okay, hopefully that, and later on, I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions about that, but that's kind of what that does in a nutshell. So as part of the planning process that the team went through, and we had a consultant, Harriman Group out of Boston, help us with this. They did several fit tests, and I just have one of them in the presentation tonight. So this is kind of a complicated piece of property based on just all the streets that are coming in here. These commercial spaces have been long vacant. There's a laundromat there. I don't know if that's necessarily the best use of the property, but that's what exists. So the consultant said, all right, we have to make sure that what we're proposing is going to make sense and is going to work. So they looked at this particular piece of property here, and they ran some analysis on this. And there's a couple examples in here. And so they ran some formulas. So if we up the density and we up the story one, what could somebody do there, provided they provide some of the amenities that are outlined in the regulations? And they looked at these on here. So they did provide that. And they ran an analysis. I highlighted here on what you can see, hopefully on the bottom left, is the regulations as crafted had the existing density is 1 unit per every 1,650 square feet of lot area. So basically, not to get too much into the weeds, an acre of land is 43,560 square feet. So if you have half an acre, you have roughly 22,000 square feet. So if you had a half acre parcel, you divide that by 1,650 square feet, and that tells you how many units of housing you can put on that property. So the regulations as proposed in the plan said if you give us a certain amount of amenities, you can reduce that density to 1,035, or if you give us even more amenities, you can get a density of 1 per 825. We upped the density for the middle ratio just to make it more consistent to 1 to 1,250. So that's kind of moving in a little bit of a little less dense direction. So what the end of the day was so fit test number 1 provided a little bit more of a modest density, whereas the second fit test increased the density a little bit. And then, that jumped a lot ahead. Okay, excuse me. So under the kind of the more dense scenario, this is what potentially could be realized on that site versus what's there now. And what these kind of scenarios takes into account is the merging of parcels, the sharing of parking, and how all those things work, because that's kind of the exercise any developer goes through when they look at these properties. And as I mentioned kind of early on, parking is a big driver on a lot of these projects because parking is expensive to build, and each space takes up, if the space is 18 feet long by 9 feet wide, that's a certain square footage. And so that you have to accommodate each parking space by the use of the property. So that's kind of one of the fit studies that was put through in the planning process. City staff took a further look at this afterwards, and I should mention that the consultant TPUDC, who is working on the zoning regs rewrite, also did their own look at the zoning regulations and design guidelines as proposed. We promised the Common Council and the Planning Commission that we would do that, and we did have them evaluate that. So they came up with a host of recommendations, and most of those we implemented. There were a few things that we didn't do just because it didn't seem to match up well. But city staff did look at some potential build-out scenarios for some of these properties as well. The kind of summary document with those fit studies is on the city's website. And what we tried to do is just from a very block diagram scale, and unfortunately right now we don't have the best software to do that, but we did what we could to see what was possible based on some of these scenarios. And I kind of the high-end conclusion that we came up with is, I think if you're on a parcel that's less than half an acre, it's going to be difficult to build that out fully based on the amenity requirements. Obviously, the larger piece of property, it gets easier to absorb some of these amenities and some of these cost items that are built in. And I'll go through the amenities, so I know hopefully I'm not jumping ahead of the discussion. And Diane, I think this is the map you're referring to. This is the one that's on the city page. And I can email you this, I think probably directly as a PDF, just this map too, if that helps.
Thank you. That's the one, Steve. Thank you.
Sure. So this kind of gray, sort of silvery color, that's the same orange dash slash with the yellow outline. That's the proposed new zone. The green is the industrial 1 zone, which I mentioned, and the blue are those properties that are currently neighborhood business that we're proposing to rezone to C residential. So this is the kind of the crux of the discussion tonight, is this gray kind of area which parallels East Avenue, as you can see, which runs north-south from I-95 down towards Gregory Boulevard. We can go through the uses in more detail. This kind of slide summarizes a little bit what we did in terms of the uses. We tried to free them up a little bit more. So we added things. So government agencies wasn't an allowed use, even though there's probably a few in that zone already. Try to add things like makerspace, artist workspace, cultural and entertainment facilities, which, because we think those are appropriate for kind of like the village feel, which what the area, the plan calls for. We remove the allowance of 1 and 2 family dwellings because this is what we're calling a TOD area, which is transit-oriented development, which kind of indicates that you're looking for a little more density in this area. We took out marinas basically because there's no water access in the village district itself. And we tried to discourage what we consider off-street parking facilities. Now, what that means is we don't want somebody solely using a property in this zone for parking. You know, obviously they need parking as part of a use, but we want the use to be the primary use of the property. And one thing, and I know Diane had asked me about this previously, is we lessened the restriction on some of the square footages for some of the commercial uses. And that was a staff recommendation. We didn't think that was necessary, but you know, ultimately, if the commission feels later on that they'd like to put those back in, I don't think we would have any significant opposition to that. The next 2 slides, I had to break it in 2 because the spreadsheet was just a little too large to see the text on here. So with any zoning district, there's what's called a bulk and height schedule. And the bulk and height schedule just kind of lists all the whether it's a setback, it's a height, it's a density, kind of all the rules for the zones, kind of the basic building blocks for any zone. So what we tried to do a little bit on here is show you what the comparison is between the proposed zone, which is the EVTZ, which is the one on the bottom, with 2 neighboring zones. And as I mentioned, the underlying zone for most of the properties now is neighborhood business. So that allows 2.5 stories and 35 feet. And as I mentioned, the EVTZ underlying zoning doesn't change. So it's still 2.5 stories and 35 feet. However, you can go up to 3.5 stories and 45 feet by special permit. And I'm going to go through what is required to gain that special permit. And then these are the other zone I put on there is the East Avenue Village District. Hopefully that's not too confusing. That's basically the area north of 95, from 95 up towards Wall Street in the green area. And this is the second part of the table to highlight a couple things that kind of changed on here. I did mention this earlier. The density is one of the big ones. So the underlying zoning, similar to the neighborhood business zone, is 1 unit for every 1,650 square feet of lot area. And you can go to 1 unit per 825 by special permit. We also remove the recreation area as a requirement. And there are 2 reasons, and it's a staff recommendation. It's a twofold reason. One is that you'll see a lot of times, especially on smaller developments, that the rec area space just turns, it's just a very narrow strip of land, as narrow as 10 feet wide. It's kind of a grassed area. We do have landscaping requirements already in the zone. So we feel that it's not necessarily the best use, and I don't necessarily consider it a rec space. And the second thing is, what we'd like to see happen is if someone's going to put a rec space in, and sometimes to accommodate this on small developments, we see them putting in very small gyms and things that I don't know if it's the best use of tenant space. What we'd like to see is maybe on the ground floor, they'll have a gym where the general public can go to as well. And then you end up with less vacancy, and it's easier for the property owner to rent out that commercial space because they have a larger client pool to gather. Okay, so this is kind of a summary slide that talks about the amenities, and the point system that goes into that. As I mentioned, the underlying zoning allows that, find my mouse here, 1 unit per 650 square feet with 2.5 stories and 35 feet. So the lower threshold is you give us 15 amenity points, you can get an extra story and 10 feet of height, and then your density drops to 1,250 square feet. The other significant thing to point out about this first bullet A here is that, in discussions with the Planning Committee of Common Council, they were particularly concerned and really wanted us to stress sustainability and, I'll say green amenities as part of this. So of those 15 points, 2/3 of those have to be what we call sustainable amenities. And I'm going to go through those in a little bit. Similarly, if you want to get the higher density, which is 825 square feet per unit versus the 1650, you have to provide 20 amenity points, and 13 of those, which is roughly 2/3, have to be what we also call the sustainable amenities. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And I think that's, what we did in response to the recommendations from the planning. So we kind of put this point system into 4 categories. The first one being infrastructure related. The second being, as I mentioned, the sustainable or green amenities. We also have some parking amenities. And the last one, there's kind of a miscellaneous category, which was an item that came up from the committee that kind of oversaw the planning process itself, was they wanted to see something. Is there a way to have rental assistance for the commercial tenants? So there's a formula in there. If they give some rent reduction, the landlord gives rent reduction to the tenants, that can qualify as an amenity. And a few examples are on the side over here, and I'm going to go into those in greater detail as we go through the presentation. And here's a picture of some of the amenities I just mentioned. This top one is powered seating. Here's public Wi-Fi. Here's a public water filling station. This is a public junction box that can be used for power and different events and things that happen. This is actually kind of a cool rain garden feature that can be kind of a public art / rain garden. This is a community garden. I'm going backwards. Here's an outdoor seating area that has kind of a solar powered charging station. This one down here is kind of an indoor seating area with a green wall. So it's got 2 examples. And here's an outdoor seating area that's kind of has, which is open to the public. It's got covered seating, so you're not sitting out in the sun. Here's some kind of art features as well. And this one's, again, is another example of a rain garden. And the design guidelines themselves is another component. And I should kind of back up a little bit and explain this, how this works. So the Connecticut General Statutes, which is 8-J, and I actually have the URL to it down here if anybody wanted to go read through that. The proposed zoning is a village district. So that's defined in the state statute. So what the village district allows the city to do is really regulate the design, because otherwise we don't really have a lot of mechanisms to do that. So we get a lot of complaints sometimes about why does this building look the way it is? And my kind of first answer to that is, well, because a lot of times we don't have the ability to say we don't like the way that looks. The village districts allows us to provide design guidelines that are very specific on the type of architecture, the type of streetscape, and in this design guidelines we put forward also gets into the type of sidewalk material, the type of street benches, even the type of bus stops and street lighting that we wanted to see there. So if someone's going to come forward with a new construction in the proposed zone, it's subject to the new design guidelines, the new zoning, and as part of the village district, there is a third-party architect or could be planner that's hired by the city to review that. The city does not pay for that. That's paid for by the applicant. That process is already in place now in many other areas of the city. We utilize it quite a bit. It sometimes is a little it can be sometimes a little more painful than I'd like. I think we're trying to streamline it a little bit more. But I think at the end of the day, the designs, particularly on the architecture of the buildings and the streetscapes, usually ends up with a better product in the end, because the architects that are reviewing it really can get into the in-depth minutia of the design, which is, I think, a little bit better approach than going with like a full-on form-based code. This is really more of a hybrid approach to that. So as I mentioned, the design guidelines looks at lots of different things. These are some images that relate to the architectural aspect of things. And so if someone's going to design things that we want to, we looked at examples of maritime architecture, and we looked at a bunch of different communities, whether they were in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, examples of areas that people liked in terms of that maritime feel. Here's some additional photos from some other areas. Actually, I think there's a couple of duplicates by accident in there as well. And we also looked at things like the storefront and how do we want the storefront to be in terms of lots of glass, lots of visibility into the space. We didn't want things where the signage overwhelmed the glass. Also looked at things like awnings and making sure that the doors don't open up into the sidewalk, because that reduces the functional area of the sidewalk, but also creates kind of a conflict with the pedestrians. We also looked at where the parking was located, how to landscape those areas, what kind of treatments for like the sidewalks and the pavers would go into that, as well as looking at the types of benches that could be there, looking at different types of bike racks, what kind of trash receptacles and recycling receptacles were there. So we kind of had a consistent theme throughout that area. And then, as I mentioned, we looked at how are the sidewalks going to look? How are the crosswalks going to be looked at? So we have those standards built in, and the Department of Public Works has actually adopted these into their street manual for this area. So anytime there's going to be an improvement in this area, they're going to have to conform to these standards. So there's some consistency and theme throughout that. I think that's it. And as I did mention, I don't have the slide here, but there is actually a lighting standard for the street lights that go in. And I did mention the bus shelters as well. So just kind of the outline the next step. So what I think is going to happen, and I don't have a date at this point in time, we'll probably have a joint public hearing between the Zoning Commission and the Planning Commission. I'm looking at the end of September for that. I haven't gotten a date, as I mentioned, but there won't be any action taken at that night. It's a joint meeting between the two commissions. So what I think we'll do, and we've done this in the past with several other studies, is in proposals for zoning regulations, we'll take those comments back, make any tweaks necessary, and then start the formal referral process from there. So just for everybody's edification, anytime there's an amendment to the zoning regulations, no matter if it's a small amendment or a large amendment, there's obviously a public hearing process that has to occur. And the Zoning Commission has to send that amendment to the Planning Commission, who's got to make a finding that the proposed regulations are consistent with the citywide plan. So they kind of looked at this already, so that it's not a new thing to them. So hopefully that process goes relatively smoothly. This URL that's here, this is where you can find all the information related to the proposed zoning regulations. It's got the latest draft of the regulations, plus a prior draft, as well as the latest draft of the design guidelines. It's got the link to the Vulcan Heights schedule I mentioned, as well as a memo that showed kind of the staff test fits. The link at the bottom here is the link to the Norwalk Tomorrow site that has the East Ave Village District plan that was adopted, as well as the draft zoning and the draft design guidelines. One thing I should mention, and this will probably be the end of it for me, what a lot of times plans to me get a little too generic, and I think that's what leads to people's complaints when plans sometimes, the proverbial things, you do a plan and you put it on the shelf and you don't do anything with the plan. I don't like to do that. I like to have plans that are actionable. So with this plan, and what I like to do, and we're doing the same thing with the industrial zone studies, I like to have a plan where there's kind of some vetted regulations and map changes within them. So it makes the process a little more, even though I know there was opposition to parts of this as we went through the process, but I think people understand where we're planning on taking these recommendations. So it's not like we come up with a plan that has like recommendations with the wording like consider rezoning East Avenue. Well, to me, that's too open-ended and doesn't really give anybody an idea of what the vision of the plan is. This kind of ties the vision to the regulations, which I think is a good logical step and gives some guidance to who's ever going to, look to improve their properties in the future. And with that, Diane, do you want me to stop sharing? I can leave it up if you like. If you want, think I'll refer back to it. However you want me to.
Yeah, maybe am I unmuted? Yeah. I think leave it up, Steve, because we may ask you to jump back to some of the slides if there's specific questions. So
and
maybe,
I do have
just leave it up if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. And I did also I have pages, the web pages for the actual regulations and the design guidelines, the full document, if that's easier to refer to.
Yep. And then this presentation you can get to me as well. So I think what we'll do, Steve, if it's okay with you, I kind of have just kind of a couple of high level things to share. And then we can open it up to Megan's a co-pilot tonight. We'll open it up to questions and comments that are coming in chat. And then for people who have their hands raised, I think we'll probably get a mix of things, some like right down to, comments on the color of the brick or very specific things versus high level of, again, we go back to just, how much of the high level stuff can still be modified, even though the TOD zone has been, basically approved. Now we're getting into the details of the implementation. A couple of things I wonder if you might be able to do for the group too. If you go back to the schedule of height and bulk, that matrix, which is the guidelines that are, this is actually for all the zones. And what Steve did was highlight a couple that would be representative to compare it to. I noticed, Stephen, I wonder if it's possible for you to take two other zones and add this into this matrix for us. So we'll have it too as a document that we can compare. Even if you think that they might not be relevant, but we'd like to see the two other village districts that are designated as village districts. So they also have to comply with the state regulations. One is the Golden Hill Village District. If you can include that in the matrix on this schedule. And then also the Rowayton Avenue Village District.
Sure,
and,
I'm going to go.
That is one page. I couldn't copy and paste it and get it to work because the column sizes were significantly different. And then for folks who might wonder why we want to do that comparison is that because the baseline guidelines come from the state statutes, as Steve suggested, we do want to make sure that there's some equity as we're looking throughout the city for, how much is being imposed on one village district versus another. And, somewhat just by virtue of having the train station there. And I think when Steve gets us that comparison, a good example would be those other zones don't identify a minimum height for new development, but the East Avenue Village TOD zone requires a minimum height of 2.5 stories and 35 feet. So that's one example of a pretty big difference. Another one is the size of the plot. In the other zones, they can have a width of max out at 50 feet. And in this zone, we're saying that the minimum size of the lot has a minimum width of 75 feet. So those are just a couple of examples. It'd just be easier to review these and make sure we're doing a sanity check with them all on one page.
Yeah, there are, just quickly on that, neither the Rowayton nor the Golden Hill, I don't think either of those, when they were adopted, had design standards with them. So to be honest with you, I mean, if somebody had a development in either of those two areas, I'd be a little nervous about telling them how the design has to be when there's no design to point to.
Right, yeah, that was kind of a curious point, but they do have the specific requirements and minimums and maximums on the height and bulk schedule. So that's pretty much what I'm interested in taking a look at. And it just, because I couldn't get it on one page, Steve, it was just really hard to do. So if you can throw those in there and get that to us,
yep.
It'd be easier. And then I have two questions that related to the third party review of this, and then we'll open it up to the floor. TPUDC, who is the consultant, they reviewed this plan from the design guidelines and the actual zoning regulations. And one of the things I mentioned right at the beginning is that they felt that because the industrial zone study was still being undertaken, and also the zoning regulations update was in the process of being written, that in the ideal situation would be that we would wait until those things were substantially complete to be able to do this overlay for East Norwalk. But when they made that comment to you and to the commissions, they cited that because there, and this is a quote, there's significant development pressure in this area. And so the TOD draft zoning and design guidelines may not be able to wait that long. And they suggest that adopting it this now may just have a statement that says that it could be changed as a result of the zoning regulations update. So it had a question, if you could define for us what they meant by that this area having significant development pressure. Are we talking about pending applications that are awaiting these approvals? Are we talking about something from the administration and the Department of Economic Development? What did that actually mean?
So the only project that I know that is kind of anxious for this process to be complete would be the Scala property at the it's not Webster Bank, the bank property.
Wells Fargo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. This property down here. So that's the only project that I've ever really had. I've had conversations with people about some of the other properties probably over 2 years ago, but some of those properties have already transferred. So the only project I know is anxious to do something is the Wells Fargo site. I had lengthy conversations with the consultant about that, and I think their chief concern is they may use some different terminology and that we don't necessarily use at the moment in our code. And there's some other things that how we state things that they're going to probably try to push us in a different direction on. So I think that they were like, maybe it would be duplicative work. So I think that was one of their chief concerns. And I think they were pretty clear. And I had this conversation with them as well, is that, while they're redoing the zoning, we're not doing a citywide planning effort again. We've gone through, that for 4 years now.
Okay. I mean, I think our concern is clear, is that we want decisions that are made, based on the best interest in terms of the community and the city at large, and not necessarily literally verbatim. They noted as significant development pressure. So you can see what the concern is there. The other major point that came up from the consultant, and it also came, I think, to you from both land use commissions, planning and zoning, and the Common Council's planning committee, was that, and from the community. So as we look at the bonus amenity points, and you went over some of them in the presentation, Steve, there was a desire to have a lot of those amenities actually be required, kind of as the price of entry, versus awarding density and height for things that really, in this day and age, especially the environmental sustainability and green initiatives, there should be a requirement that new buildings and new developments incorporate those to begin with. Now, we know that you did go back and have our legal department look at, the city's legal department look at the state statutes, see if we have the ability to do that. And I guess we would pose that question again. And for the audience here, the reason why this is important is because when you actually look at these documents that Steve has on the website, you'll see it doesn't really take a whole lot to achieve the 15 or the 20 points. And many of the amenity combinations that a developer could do to get to those aren't really necessarily meaningful to the community. They tend to be very low cost for a developer to implement, but then they get financial benefits in perpetuity for having put them in. And when I say financial benefits, I mean the greater height and the density of the residential units in the building. So I think there still needs to be a discussion, Steve, on the number of bonus possibilities, how they get awarded, and possibly or definitely raising these minimum requirements of, say, 15 points up, to maybe double that, and then 20 points significantly higher. The second point that I want to make there is that it does seem to be pressure that came out of the planning committee to really focus on the sustainable amenities. And we did recognize that there are some, environmental advocates in the city, and one of the common council members is very honed in on these aspects. But again, in this day and age, we would think that the city would say all new development should have to comply now with some of these state-of-the-art sustainable amenities and have them be reasonable. The example you put up of the parcel where Mike's Deli is for the fit test, where you showed the pollinator pathway. I don't know if you can go back to that screen. That may not really be something that's feasible or maybe desired by the community to that extent of that much of a parcel, as much as we all want pollinator pathways. But I'm not sure if people would look and say this type of sustainable green bonus amenity would be worth the additional density. So those are my 2 points, or 3 points, are kind of high level. I just wanted to get those out on the table, and then open it up to the residents here. Megan, I'll leave it up to you if you want to check for raised hands or go back and forth between chat comments.
Yeah, I'll go in. You can hear me, right?
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go in order of when they came through. So the first question is from Roberta, and the question is, what is the possibility of exploring residential parking passes?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good. I didn't mention that. That is a recommendation within the plan, and I know that there's been a turnover at the Transportation, Mobility, and Parking Department, but I did actually talk to them about that the other day, because we're talking about budget requests. We're starting, sadly, we're already thinking about budget requests for July 2022 already. And that was one of the things we talked about was making sure we had funding and how to implement that. So I don't know if it's going to come as a study, but I'm advocating that East Norwalk be kind of the front and center with that. I know there were concerns in parts of South Norwalk when the mall was under construction about all the overflow parking on the streets. But East Norwalk, I think, has a permanent issue with overflow parking onto the residential streets. I think that's a residential parking permit program in this area makes a lot of sense. But I'm not an expert on residential parking permit programs, so I'll have to leave that up to somebody who knows a little bit more.
And then a comment from the same person, properties would be better served by replacing sidewalks rather than facade improvement. When can Osborne Avenue expect to see safer sidewalks?
I would have to check with either DPW or TMP to see where that's on the schedules. If there are existing sidewalks on the road and they're going to pave the road, they usually do the sidewalks at the same time, because they don't want to go in and do the road and then make a mess doing sidewalks later. But I'd have to ask.
Okay. All right. Then next we've got a raised hand from Ellen Garcia. Ellen, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Okay, good. This is actually it's Lou Garcia. I'm Ellen's husband. And I'm an architect. I've been in Norwalk for a long time, over 50 years. And when this first came up for early review, I was very much against it because of many reasons. One of the main reasons that I have always looked into and being an architect for the past 30 years is that it's going to be almost impossible, if not very difficult, to be able to have all this development and still be able to meet the requirements of parking as they exist today. And my concern is a couple of concerns. There's one, physically, I'm not sure how any architect or any developer out there is going to be able to meet the requirements if the city maintains the requirement. Now, we all know that developers have a lot of cloud, and my concern is that someday down the road, someone's going to come in with a very nice looking project, but it's going to say, we don't have enough parking. Can we get some reprieve from having to put in 30 parking spaces? We're going to do 5 or 10. And because we're so close to the train station, everyone is going to walk to the train station, hop on a train, and go their merry way. And that is completely untrue. I'm an architect, and we all know that we all depend on our cars for daily living. You know, on a train and go down to Stamford or New York for work, that's fine. But we all need to get to school learners, and we all need to get to our dentist, and we all need to get our produce, food bought. So the idea that you're going to do away with parking is in a suburban area is kind of ludicrous. You're going to need to have parking, and like I keep saying again, I am very concerned that the city later on is going to start making some kind of a pact with these developers to reduce the amount of parking, because that is going to be the only way that some of these developments, especially with 3 stories, are going to be able to exist. I know, being an architect, I know how big a parking spaces requirement is. I know how much it needs to back out. I know how many parking spaces are required given different type of uses. So the idea of parking here in cars is going to be a nightmare. And I'm still to this day not sure how that's going to be developed. The only way that I think that could be done, and Steve kind of says that that's not going to happen, is that these developers create some kind of a public parking in an area where it could be good looking. I have designed some very good looking parking spaces that can fit in with the rest of the neighborhood, but have a central area where someone can walk to and hop in their car and go their merry way. I don't see it any other way. So that's one issue. The other issue that I have is that I completely agree with Diane about these issues of amenities. It's a joke. It really is. I mean, anyone can put up a bench. A bench will cost you maybe $1,000 at the very most. You know, that they have this internet hookups. It's kind of a joke to think that a developer couldn't produce that in 2 seconds and be part of an amenity where he's going to be able to do another story. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I know it makes sense to developers in the city. So that's another thing that, so therefore, I think Diana is completely correct about the idea that some of these things should be implemented and not as amenity, but part of the requirement, especially, like you said, solar panels. It's something that we should all need. I don't have all the amenities in front of me, so we don't probably all go one by one, but these items are very easy.
Lou, can you?
Yes.
Lou, do you think we could wrap it up? You've been speaking for 5 minutes. Is there one question or one general sentence to give to Steve?
Yeah, I have a question in reference to the chart that Steve came up. Can you put up the chart stuff from Steve for a minute with the requirements for zoning?
Is that the one, Lou, for the minimum and
So
maximum?
I'm a little confused here. So I'm a little confused here because on the left says East Avenue Village District, and then it has 2.5 stories, 35 feet, and 35 feet for hotels on a parcel of 3 acres or more. Hotels, is this only for hotels, Steve?
So that that's the East Avenue Village District. That's not anything we're proposing to change. The proposed zone is the EVTZ at the bottom. So this is
Yeah,
existing regulations, no change.
Steve, I'll clarify that too. I think it's easier for people to understand because these words are so close together, the terminology. The East Avenue Village District essentially is the green, and it goes a little bit beyond Norwalk City Hall coming towards the highway. I don't even think it actually goes all the way out to the highway. So there's some restrictions there for that village district in terms of the height. And I believe that the regulation having to do with hotels was because of the existing structure for the Norwalk Inn and Conference Center, and then any future uses. And so, this is for around the green. The interesting thing there, though, too, Lou, is the comparison of the by special permit, to go to the 3.5 stories there. So, Steve, do you want to address a couple of the things that Lou brought up? And when you talk about parking and the amenities, I can say, and Steve knows this, historically, not just in Norwalk, but everywhere, very oftentimes the two things that drop off the list of the zoning requirements by hardship are parking, where they have an option to do, I think, fee in lieu of parking and some other creative options, and the bonus amenities that the public would most like. So they get approved, and then they come back after some period of time and say, we really can't do this. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of will on approving commissions to then say no, especially since at the time that a developer is likely to pull those types of desired amenities, the project is very well underway. Lots of money has been spent, lots of time, gone through all the approvals. And, the commissions are reluctant then to say no, because then you may end up with something, especially, as you know, if they've already torn down a building and we're left with an empty lot. And I think the other thing too, Steve, is that some of this, I think you've looked to remedy by dealing with the consultant with a concept called shared parking. And I've talked with Lou Garcia both offline and in other meetings regarding shared parking between buildings and uses, but that would have to really be regulated where there is some sort of a legal document that binds those parties to cooperating with each other for parking. I think one of the examples is if you had an office building where there's a lot of parking needed during the day versus something like a church where those parking lots are virtually empty, was one of the examples they gave.
So I'll try to, I have some notes, so if I don't address one of the items you want me to address, just let me know. So starting on the kind of like the sustainable amenities. So, and you and Diana had mentioned that we did ask Corporation Council to look at that. Can we require that? Can we say from this day forward, you have to put solar on every building? And the answer to that is no, we can't regulate that. It's the state enabling statute for zoning doesn't allow us to do that. However, what we've done here, and we did this recently, there was a text amendment approved last year for a senior housing type development on Richards Avenue. And what we told them was, all right, we'll let you, basically, we really didn't give them any additional density than they could have gotten, if I'm remembering correctly. But what we allowed them to do was kind of cluster the homes. So that saved them a lot of money on the development itself. They didn't have to develop the whole site. But what we said, all right, we want to have 40% of the property. We want it to be open. And we want solar on the roof of every one of these buildings. And I don't know if they were happy about that, but that was agreed to. So what these regulations are, took a similar path to that. So we said, all right, the underlying zoning is not changing, as I mentioned here. So you can see right here that right now, as I mentioned, Lou said he's an architect. He can come in and design a 2.5 story, 35-foot high building on that East Avenue right now. He can come in today and if it all meets all the requirements, you can get a permit for that. What we've allowed to do, and keep in mind that, there's a big difference between a lot of these other areas and this area. this area is, one of the first things I highlighted, is within a short walk to the train station. So it's kind of where, if you're going to have additional development, that's kind of where you want that to be, as located closely to your mass transit as possible. So what we said, we said we'll give you an additional 1 story, 10 feet of height, and some additional density if you give us back these amenities that are outlined in that schedule. And there's more to the amenities than I showed you tonight. There's there's more of them. And I think I may have left one off the list, which is kind of the equivalency of obtaining like LEED certifications. I think that's another one we have on the list. So the premise is, if you give us these X amount of points of amenities, we'll give you some additional bonus. And 2/3 of those have to be what we're calling sustainable amenities. And, one thing I'm not 100% certain of yet, which is one of the reasons we're going to have this a public hearing in September. I think if I put this out to a crowd of developers, I think they're going to probably argue that we can't do this, is too many points you're asking for. So I think there's going to be a different take to that discussion. So I mean, I'm curious to let somebody put pen to paper and show me where it doesn't work from their perspective. And I'd like to know. The last thing we want to do is propose a set of regulations that somebody says, you know what, they're asking for too much. And we're at the same point we're at now, because otherwise we wasted a lot of time and money for nothing. So that's another part of it. The parking itself, parking, as I mentioned, parking is always a challenge. That's why I think, and Lou very well may be correct, if there's a 1/4 acre lot, you may not see anybody try to take advantage of the additional height and density because they might not be able to park it. That's why I think, I think it maybe makes sense and is consistent with the plan, is that someone will try to consolidate a lot of these 1/4 acre lots into a larger, more developable site. That happens now with any project that anybody wants to work on. That's not a single family house. It's the larger the lot and the piece of property you have to work with, the easier it is to get something done. You just have more land to work with. It's easier to fit the parking spaces and fit the green spaces on there. Right now, the regulations do talk about the existing zoning regulations. They do have fee in lieu of parking. No one really takes advantage of fee in lieu of parking. I'm not sure why. I think it's kind of it's a reasonable approach, but for some reason, it's really not used widely. The regulations do have shared parking allowances built into them now. So it's not like we're adding anything new. And you are required to have a legal instrument between the properties. So you'd have to have a lease. So someone couldn't, it's important to keep in mind when we look at these things from a zoning perspective, that we don't let somebody do shared parking unless they have that parking to share. So the zoning code has a requirement per use for X amount of spaces. They have to have residual spaces to give in order for them to share that. And keep in mind, this is a pretty important thing to know, that someone could come back to the city and say, I can't build this, and start, during the middle of the project and I ran into problems. Well, unless they're able to seek something that's in the regulations now, they can't just go ahead and get that relief. They're going to have to go through a process of trying to amend the regulations, just like anybody else is entitled to do. They have the legal right to come in and ask the question. And that's a public hearing process. It has to go through the commissions, and the public gets to weigh in and on as well. So right now, if somebody comes in and has a project that's approved and it's required to have 50 parking spaces, and they come in and they say, you know what, we have a problem, we can only build 40 spaces. Well, they're going to either have to scale the project back, they can try to get a variance for that, or they can come in and try to amend the regulations to make that fit. Those are all existing legal rights that they have. It doesn't mean that they're entitled to it or it's likely to happen, but they do have the legal right to ask that question. I hope that answered. That was kind of rambling, but I hope it answered the question.
Thanks, Steve.
I just have one.
Megan, can we go to another? Thanks, Lou. Can we take another question from a raised hand or in the comments?
Yeah, then I'm still going in time order. The next question was in the chat. It was brick sidewalks will turn into a lumpy, bumpy mess over time. I guess, Steve, do you have any way to address brick sidewalks as a design feature?
Yeah, and usually these are pavers versus brick. I'm not an engineer, but it's my understanding if they're installed and constructed correctly, that's not an issue. But if they pop up in time and that's regular maintenance, just like a crack in a concrete sidewalk needs to get fixed.
All right, the next one is, what exactly does shared parking look like and how does it work?
We touched on this a little bit, but you could, so right now there's a couple different things and maybe people are confusing the two. But there's right now you can get mixed use credits. So say I had a 3.5 story building. I have a ground floor where I have some kind of commercial use. The second floor has got an office tenant, and say there's a restaurant on the ground floor, an office, and then you have some apartments or condos or something up above. The regulations have right now, the consultant look at the zoning regulations doesn't like our formula, so I'm imagine that's going to change. There's mixed use credits. So the idea is that, the restaurant's busy mainly at dinner time, but also busy at lunch, whereas the office is busy during the day, and the residents are only there mainly at night and they're off at work or something like that. So there's an idea that you don't have to park each individual use on the site. There's a formula you can apply where you get a credit for certain uses. And that's already built into the zoning regulations now. That's not a new concept that we've added for this area. Shared parking specifically was kind of the example, and I think maybe it was Diane that mentioned it, where there's a church next door and they have a parking lot that's vastly empty Monday through Friday, and then there's a property next door who they're hemmed in. They can't add any parking, but they have a nice project, or they've got a project they'd like to build, and they're able to lease parking spaces from the church, and the church is able to demonstrate that they have excess parking. That's kind of how the shared parking analysis would work.
Okay. The next question is, who would be responsible for maintaining and enforcing items like the fountains, electronic amenities?
Sure, and we did take fountains out of the amenities just because. Yeah, thank you. We did take out the fountains as an amenity. There's water features built into some of the, when we had the example of the art that was also a rain garden. Just because fountains are kind of, you use them half the year and then you don't use them half the year. So it's kind of a waste a little bit. But the amenities are the responsibility of the property owner, even if the property changes hands. So I think I talked to you guys, maybe it was back in December, because I pulled an old presentation up for ENNA where we talked about the different levels of permits that are available and required by the city. So a special permit's kind of the highest level of permit that somebody has to obtain. And as is highlighted here, to get that bonus, they have to do a special permit. So if they receive the special permit, the plans and the certificate of special permit are filed on the land record. So say somebody had a public seating area out at the front, and it was supposed to have, this landscape feature with it, and it was supposed to remain shaded and open to the public. And say you had a new owner and says, well, I don't know how to do that anymore. And he blocked it off and cut all the trees down. Well, they would be in violation of the special permit and then subject to enforcement by the city.
Okay. Next, we'll go to the raised hand from Nick.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for doing this. I guess I have a comment and a quick, I guess it's a two-parter question. I do want to say I agree with everybody's comments around the sort of parking and what seems to be a low barrier to entry, but I won't beat a dead horse. I'll just kind of note that. The question that I have is more about when you change zones or make some of these changes, what happens to the cases that are up for removal? And so you gave an example of, and specifically, like you gave the example of if Liberty Square were to be rezoned as a historic district, and also for the EVTZ with the removal of some of those uses there. And so I'm trying to bridge the gap. I heard something you said before around, well, we don't have a lot of ability for enforcement, but then if something, if the zoning changes and there are these things that are already in place, so what do you guys do for stuff that might not be desirable in those locations where there's a zoning change that might change an existing use? How does that change?
Okay, so if I don't answer your question correctly, please ask again. I'll do my best. So there's just a little sidebar. There's a big difference between a historic district and a village district. So historic district is there's issues with that. So we need to think about that a little bit further, because that can be, we probably wouldn't change the zoning in we're not proposing to change the zoning in the Liberty Square or the Cove Ave area there. We don't want to change the zoning there, just so that's clear. But we're looking at those more as like preservation tools more than anything else. But so if you had and I think this was your question. So if you had an area that you rezoned, and say that the example I gave out on Winfield Street, there was say there was hypothetically, there was a gas station out there and we rezoned it, and the gas station was no longer allowed to be there per zoning. That gas station can continue to function and operate as a business. If they wanted to expand, say they had just pump islands in a little place to pay for gas, and they wanted to put in a convenience store, they probably wouldn't be allowed to do that, because that would be an expansion of a non-conforming use at that point. So the city's not going to go in and try to forcibly remove any of those uses. They just become non-conforming at that juncture. I don't know if that was the question that you asked.
It is. So what I heard you say was the answer to part A in terms of the historic district is that districting itself may have any changes for the uses, because that goes for a zone and that's a different tool. And what I heard from the second is, as long as they're still operating under that zone and there's no changes that would require for them to go back to permitting, then they could still continue to operate.
Right. Yeah. The historic district really wouldn't be. Sorry.
It must be dinner time there for the treats.
I heard her come in, and I immediately texted and said, somebody come get this dog, because it's right about the time where the deer come into the yard and she is on patrol. So sorry about that. Can you repeat? I apologize. Can you repeat that, please?
So basically, if the zone changes and removes a use, and somebody is still operating, they can continue to operate unless they actually go and apply for any sort of changes.
Correct. Yeah. They even if we change the zone, anybody has the right to come in and ask to change the regulations to whatever they can dream up. Doesn't mean staff level we can't say no. They have to get in front of the commission, and they get the opportunity to plead their case. But anybody has the legal right to come request an amendment to the regulations.
Thank you.
All right, there's some more questions in the chat. There's one about parking for people with limited mobility and such. Is there anything in the plan that addresses that?
So there are ADA requirements are built into the building code. So those are they're built in already. So we don't have any say. There's nothing in the plan that it calls out for additional ADA spaces. So we just refer to what's required in the building code. And there are specific requirements in there related to how big the space can be. Do they need, when you get over certain sizes, you have to provide a van access space. They have to be within a certain distance to the building and have a path that's a safe path to the building for the wheelchair. So those are built into the building code already.
Okay. All right. And then there's some more comments about wanting the existing sidewalks to be maintained, and that we'd love to see the amenities required as the base requirement for a building, and some statements about how parking is a problem. The question is, should we also think about getting to carbon neutral in these plans? The area is vulnerable given the proximity to the sound, so we should be thinking in those terms.
Yeah, and again, I think from city staff and speaking for, and I can't speak for everybody, but in this case, I'll jump in. I think we all want to get to those places. We don't have the ability to, as I mentioned, we can't require them right now. So I've had conversations with lots of the council members about this and other folks. So as I mentioned, the base zoning right now is 2.5 stories, 35 feet. I mean, theoretically, the city could go in today and in the neighborhood business zone and say, we're going to cut it back to 1.5 stories, 15 feet. And then we could say, all right, if you want to get to 2.5 stories, 35 feet, you got to give us these green amenities. And then if you want to get to 3.5, 45, you got to give us 100 points and 50 amenities. I would not advocate for that policy because I think that everything in the city would come to a grinding halt. And I know there are probably people saying good, but I wouldn't advocate for that. I think that, we're more and more incorporating these things into our thinking. And as we do rezoning, we're requiring that more and more. And I think we'll definitely get to those places and get to the items where things want to get to. I think the city on our kind of midterm horizon is going to look at a larger sustainability coastal resilience plan. We're starting to do little pieces of that now, but I think we'll definitely get there. We're just not at the mandate stage at this point.
Okay. All right, there's some more commentary in the chat. Suggestions that high density buildings should require contributions to schools. Some commentary around the fact that we already have issues with traffic in schools and existing amenities. I'm searching for the next question. Some more comments around the amenities not really benefiting East Norwalk residents, and that the amenities would just benefit the people in those buildings. Do you have any comment on that, Steve?
On the last part, I can't. But some of those, I don't know if I would agree with that. I mean, especially if there's public seating areas involved. One thing to keep in mind, like we went through this exercise, it's semi-related. When we were looking at a recent development in South Norwalk, there was this big discussion about this. We wanted a public plaza. Then it's like, well, there's a public plaza just approved at this other development nearby, and we have another public plaza over there. So do we want to have the same thing on every site? So do we want an outdoor seating area that's a certain size on every property? Now, will that just lead to a bunch of public seating areas that really are kind of half full or half used? So those are kind of like the tricky little balancing things that we want to get to. I would argue that if you have, even from a sustainability standpoint, that if you have, like someone's implementing rain gardens or they're looking at geothermal, that doesn't have a direct benefit to the residents of whether they're East Norwalk or Norwalk as a whole, but they do benefit everybody, because if you have rain gardens or geothermal, you're using less energy, and or you're taking your stormwater and then you're using it in a much more beneficial factor than just allowing, right now, a lot of places just have sheet flow runoff for their water. So it's just going from a parking lot to a drain to the sound. So this is a way we can treat the water and do that, which does benefit the people and the sound directly. So I think all these will have a benefit to the city, maybe not like a direct benefit where it's like this cool outdoor space where I can go hang out Saturday afternoon. You might get some of that. Hopefully you'll get that at key junctions and key intersections throughout the new zone. But a lot of these we think will have indirect benefits to everyone.
Thank you, Steve. One question, if residential artist live workspaces are allowed in the industrial zone, what measures would be taken to prevent fraudulent claims and subletting of units for non-artist use?
That's tricky. It's a really fair and good question. It's kind of like right now, if somebody puts in an illegal apartment in their basement, we'd have to catch them. So if you went in, like as we talked about before, if you had a special permit to you get some kind of bonus for an artist live workspace, so we'll give you a little break on something if you put in this space, and then 3 years down the road the artist is no longer there and they can't lease it to a similar artist, and you know what, they carve it into 2 or 3 units and then just rent them out as efficiency apartments or something like that. We'd have to catch them. So if we caught them, then they're obviously subject to an enforcement action because they're not binding by the terms of the special permit. And so there'd be consequences there, but we do have to catch them at doing that. And it's hard for us to catch them. Sometimes we can catch them through like a real estate listing or something like that, or more often than not, somebody rats them out, or, if they come in with the easy way is they're not very bright and they come in with a permit to add plumbing and bathrooms in these areas. And we're like, hey, wait a minute, this is a special permit. There's a condition on the land records. And why are there in this one live workspace now there's 3 separate full bathrooms? Something seems a little quirky here. And once in a while we do catch people like that, but we do have to catch them in the act.
Steve, I'll make a suggestion on that too, because this is a valid point for many of the uses then. I think maybe you can employ what I think they use to enforce workforce and affordable housing, where the property owner is required to have the leases available and to show what the units are and what the prices are. I think that also goes to what they have to provide to the tax assessor's office. So I think the enforcement is a really important point, and maybe what you do is you build into it that there has to be an audit, every 1 to 3 years of the actual leases that are in effect.
Yeah, actually, that's a good
I'm pretty
idea.
sure that's how they do workforce right now.
Yeah, we do the workforce's annual reporting, and so are the accessory apartments. So I think that's fair. I don't think there'll be any opposition to including that.
Yeah, we want to try to move enforcement away from residents, having to report things, especially where some of the enforcement things that go through the city, it's not really easy to do anonymously, as you know.
All right, I think there's one big question here from Judy. They're asking, what is the city trying to accomplish and why with the TOD?
Sure. So we went through this in prior discussions and also during the planning process for this. So, this area, East Norwalk, as I said this before, is one of my favorite parts of the city. However, East Avenue itself needs some help. There are things that I identify as problems, and then I think it's been I've been here, like I said, almost 5 years now, and I've seen very little improvement. And the projects that have come in, I would imagine you probably agree with me, haven't necessarily improved the area or really what people want for the area. And I'm told by others with a history that that area has been like that for a long time now. And I think there's a reason for that. I think chiefly the reason is that the existing zoning regulations, and particularly on East Avenue, and that's really what my focus of this discussion is, the regulations are such that you really can't do anything to improve your property. There's no incentive for somebody to do something better than what is there now. So that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish. Also, and I understand that there's, the way people work and live and travel has changed because of COVID, and probably there's going to be some permanent changes that come out of that. But you are within walking distance, in a very short walking distance from a mainline train station. I know it's not the South Norwalk station, but it is a train station that's going to get improvements to it, improvements for the better for the transit riders. So that that's another reason that this is a major economic engine for the city, this train station. It's underutilized and underserved. And what this plan is, and what the zoning that follows the plan is looking to do, is try to capitalize that and improve the area and add additional housing in this area, which I think is needed to get some more feet on the street.
Great, thanks, Steve. There's one last question, which is, will the public hearing in September be in person?
I don't know. I actually, as and I can't remember if it was on Diane's initial bullet points, but like our larger planning process for the zoning rewrite is scheduled for mid-September. And I don't even know if we're going to be able to do that in person yet. My preference, to be honest with you, is to do these virtually, because I think it allows for a better discussion than having a lot of people shouting from the back of the room, which tends to happen sometimes at these meetings. I know Diane's not going to like that comment, but to be honest, from the people that facilitate the meetings and the people that are the commissioners on the meetings, I think that everybody seems to like the virtual process for the public hearings better.
Well, Steve, I'll address that, and then I'll wrap this up to be respectful of your time. We always appreciate you coming. I think, too, that the discussions have been around the city going, and I think the mayor actually stated this publicly, that the city's going to look at going hybrid from now on. So that as we move to in-person, which people really tend to like, there'll still be a hybrid version where they can participate via Zoom. So we can accommodate those folks who would rather be accommodating their own schedules to be at home and to participate. So I'm hopeful that's the case. I think while it's convenient on Zoom for a lot of reasons, we do miss a lot of the interaction and the sentiment and the real dialogue that we would normally get in person. So I hope you'll keep an open mind on that. I want to make one comment too, though, Steve, when you talk about someone asked, like, why this in East Norwalk, and we look at some of the other development in the city. Most of what's gone on is really what you identified on that map as the urban core. And I think we have a pretty good finger on the pulse, and a lot of people really aren't thrilled with the results of the past, 10 or 20 years of the redevelopment agency and what it resulted in both South Norwalk, West Avenue, and Wall Street. And so if that's kind of the benchmark in terms of what's potential for East Avenue, even though we know it's not that scale, I think people are very concerned. And I think another concern that may come up with it is, I know that you publicly told the zoning and the planning commissions that at this point you're spending some time actually consulting with the redevelopment agency and having them take a look at the zoning guidelines and design guidelines and regulations. And that would be cause for great concern in itself in East Norwalk. And I know I speak for the community when I say that. And I just want to remind you that part of the reason ENNA came out supporting the effort to get the grant to look at TOD here to begin with was because we wanted to make sure we had an effort to get out ahead of any effort by the redevelopment agency to come into East Norwalk and come up with plans of their own, especially based on what they've done elsewhere in the city. And we think under the HUD guidelines that either East Norwalk is in that position right now where they could, or will be in that position very soon based on the socioeconomic demographics that we have here. So I think we need to be respectful of the fact, as you pointed out many times, that we're not looking to do in East Norwalk what we've done in South Norwalk or on West Avenue or Wall Street. But I think we do have to really be respectful of the fact that there's still a lot of resistance from the people who live here, even for the scope and the design elements that you put in. And we don't want to just come to, public hearings and other presentations that you're going to do, just to have something that really isn't going to take into account the public feedback that you're hearing tonight. I'll close by saying I see other comments coming in. I would encourage people, like Steve said before, please feel free to write directly to Steve yourself at City Hall if you have questions or comments that you want answered. It's S. Kleppin, Kleppin at norwalkct.org, or you can funnel everything through East Norwalk Neighborhood Association, and we'll compile it and get it to Steve, and that's info@eastnorwalk.org. And Steve will be providing us with the presentation he did tonight, and the map that we can print and share, and the updated bulk and height matrix, I think.
Diane, can I just address one quick thing? So the only involvement the redevelopment agency had was that they have one staff member who was actually an architect, and I asked him just look at the point system and the design guidelines, just give me his thoughts. So there's no, and I think if you looked at the work plan for the redevelopment agency, their kind of scope and mission is changing quite a bit from what they were even 2-3 years ago. So they're kind of a different entity and different body with a different focus than they were previously.
Okay, fair enough. Steve, thanks very much. We appreciate you coming into, sometimes it's a lion's den over here, coming in and sharing what you've shared with the commission so people hear it firsthand, and being able to answer some of the questions and listen to some of the comments, which we hope that you take to heart. And I'm thinking we may have you back again, as this thing moves to public hearings, and if not, we'll just communicate via email. Thank you, Steve. And
Sure,
just before we adjourn go ahead, Steve.
I was just saying thank you.
Okay,
done.
thank you. And before we adjourn, just let everybody know our next meeting is in August. It's August 16th. I gave a little hint in our last email blast that we're going to have some news from the parcel that's the Masonic Lodge on Gregory Boulevard. Some potential changes are coming up there. I know Steve is familiar with them. So we're going to hear about those. And we'll continue to send information out on this plan as well. And keep everybody in the loop. So make sure you tell your neighbors and friends to get on the email list, because that's where we keep everybody updated. And at this point, we'll go ahead and adjourn and see everybody next month.